There was an article that came out several years ago. The journalist, her name is Peggy Noonan. And from time to time, you probably have seen Peggy Noonan. If you haven't read her stuff, a lot of times she has been on the news about things. And this article was about culture, about values. And as she wrote it, she said, it seems like they're changing. The values and the culture that we live in are changing. And as she had that article, there was a lot of good stuff in it, but as she came to the end, there's something that really stood out to me. She said this: what we applaud, you encourage. Be careful what you celebrate. That stuck with me. What you applaud, you encourage. Be careful what you celebrate. What do we, as a culture, as a society, celebrate? I believe we celebrate foolishness. I don't mean funny stuff. Funny is a part of our life. But we celebrate foolishness and we applaud dysfunctional. And as I think about it, you think of our celebrities. Where does the word celebrity come from? People we celebrate, okay? So celebrities, for the most part, is there any more dysfunctional group so often than the celebrities? They're the people we applaud. They're the people we celebrate. And if you get dysfunctional enough, you can probably have your own TV show, right? And you can make millions. That's just kind of the way it works. See, we as a society, we have come to where we are entertained by the dysfunctional. What we applaud, we become. A lot of us aren't that entertained by it. Because I know for myself, for almost my whole life and week after week, my job is to pick up the pieces, the disasters, the pain, the hurts that define foolishness that people bring within their life that just destroys. That when you celebrate these things, you become dysfunctional as well. And that's our culture. But I really believe nobody sets out to ruin their life. But we see thousands of people in our society do it every day. But what if there's a better way to live? Think about it. We only have one life, right? Only one life. Would you then want to live this one life with the highest degree of skill? What if living with skill, the longings, the hopes, the dreams of our souls were actually realized? Would you be interested in that? And that's what I want to talk about for the next 3 Sundays. We're going to be looking at one of the places in the Bible where it tells us how to have skillful lives, skillful living. It is the place we find in Scripture that we call it the wisdom passages of Scripture. And so one of those places we would look would be in the book of Proverbs. Because the book of Proverbs is about wisdom, but putting that into practice is skillful living. How to live here upon this earth. And so God clues us in how this works. So this morning we're going to look at chapter 1. Next week, chapter 2, then chapter 3. I would love someday to preach the whole book of Proverbs, but you probably don't want me to do one after another because it is pretty intense. And so someday in the future, we'll probably look at then 4, 5, and 6. So hang on. Here we go. As I handed the notes to Amanda so that she can keep up with PowerPoint, I said, this really isn't a book this morning, okay? Sorry. I'll go as quick as I can, but it is important for us to understand because it's about skillful living. And so this first chapter we look at, but before we get into the chapter, you think of the Proverbs. The Proverbs seem pretty simple because they appear to be pithy little sayings that are easy to understand, easy to hold on to. And so you say, hey, I can understand this stuff because maybe you've been reading through your Bible and you went through Numbers, okay? Or at least you said you read all of Numbers, okay? Yeah, okay. We're through Numbers, okay? You went through Leviticus, all those Levitical laws. And you come to the Proverbs, you say, hey, I can understand this. All those little sayings. Like it's better to live on a rooftop than with a contentious woman. Nobody smiled. Some guys are smiling just a little bit. Okay. But, we get that. We understand these things, okay? That is a part of Proverbs, okay? I won't do any of the rest of those. But they're pithy little sayings. But if we think, I know the pithy little sayings, so therefore I understand Proverbs, we've only scratched the surface. See, even though it seems easy to understand, it is hard to teach because it's not just a bunch of pithy little sayings. Because if we see, I know these little sayings, so therefore I understand Proverbs, it's kind of like picking up an instrument that is new to you and you learn the C scale and you say, I've mastered the instrument. Okay, you've just begun, right? You've just begun. There's a lot to Proverbs. So here's two things that help us in understanding it. It looks like it's a whole bunch of random little sayings that's thrown together. Kind of like if you broke open a whole bunch of fortune cookies, okay? It's just a whole bunch of random things. But what they're talking about is life. Because life, there's a lot of things within life. And so some things may be talking about temper or money or lust or mouth. All those come together because that's life. It's the same way within our life. So often when you're trying to figure out what's going on in your life or you're trying to help someone else, usually we start with the surface, don't we? But we know there's a lot more things that really are part of what's happening instead of the surface. And that's Proverbs. All these come together and teach us what life is about and what skillful living is about. The second thing is always remember it was written by a Hebrew, okay? And we'll look a little bit more at that a little bit later. The Hebrew thinking is different than yours and my thinking for the most part. And so we see the Proverbs go in cycles. Like when we went through the book of Revelation, looking at some of those things, how you interpret the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation goes in cycles. I believe it is cycle after cycle. It is not time period after time period. Because with each cycle you go, you get more information, more understanding, and there's intensity in your learning. And that's the Proverbs. Solomon wrote most of it. He is a Hebrew. And so he is speaking primarily then to Hebrews. And so it's going to go the way their education system went. You go through cycles, you hit something. The book of James is that way too, when you think of the themes that are within James. So you see intensity takes place every time you see that same thing. But it all fits together as a whole. And each time you get more depth, more understanding, more discovery. And so I believe that's the way Proverbs is organized. It's not just a whole bunch of pithy sayings that's there. So for our discussion, I'm going to highlight some of the verses of chapter 1. So Proverbs 1:1 says, and this is from the New American Standard Translation, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. So here we see the author. But understand, the whole book of Proverbs, Solomon is not the author of all, but primarily he is the author of all. But we also see, because it's inspired, the author is God. It comes God through Solomon to us, and Solomon is that primary author. And then what is the purpose of Proverbs? Verse 2, to know wisdom and instruction. Okay, so we're seeing all this right from the beginning. The author, what is the purpose? And so always when we see the purpose of something, we need to use that as a filter, okay? So if this is the purpose, help me to understand that it is about wisdom and instruction. And so whenever you see that word know or knowledge, that is what it's trying to help us to see. How to have skillful living by having wisdom. But that doesn't mean head knowledge. It's not here just for us to memorize the little pithy sayings, and so I have head knowledge. Because that's not the way Hebrews taught. That's the way the Greeks taught. And we, in our education system, primarily come from the Greek aspect. That's why we have tests, okay? We have tests where we cram as much information we can. And if you are like most students, as late as possible as you can before the test, you try to get that in there so you can regurgitate it back on paper. That's the Greek way of doing things. That's not the Hebrew way. So the Greeks would say there's head knowledge. The Hebrews would say there is knowledge if you know it and you live it. Okay? That you really understand it. So it is lived out. So when they talk about knowledge and to know something, that means that it is being demonstrated within your life. Not that you just know it here. There's a big difference. So if you know it, you live it. If you don't live it, you don't know it. Okay? So that's the contrast in Proverbs between the wise person and the foolish. And so there's so many of those contrasts. A lot of that in the Proverbs is there is the virtuous woman and there is the prostitute. So there is wisdom, there is foolishness. And this is the overall thought within Proverbs. So with verse 2, when you read Proverbs 31 about the virtuous woman, there is more to it than just a Mother's Day sermon. Because as it talks about the virtuous woman, what is it talking about? It's talking about the overall thought, what is wisdom? The wisdom is like this virtuous woman. So it's being spelled out, it's being shown to us because wisdom is lived out. And so you can see she is wise from the way she lives. That's the best way, and for them, the only way to see wisdom. And so this is the idea of wisdom within the Proverbs. It is experienced. It is skillful living. So what is wisdom? The main word that we see in the Hebrew, it has two concepts. And this is important for us too. The first concept of wisdom, it is like a skill. So if you are a skillful craftsman, okay, you have a skill. If you're an artist, okay, if you're a carpenter. And so in this time, it would be like with Solomon's temple, when all the different ones came with their skills to build this. There were all sorts of different smiths, goldsmiths. They were stonemasons. They were people that could work with wood, the cedars of Lebanon, all these. They were skillful. And that is part of the concept of wisdom. It is having great skill, the ability to live this out like an artist. But also the second concept is instruction. Instruction carries with it the idea of training, of discipline, the idea of correction. We would probably think of a coach. A coach teaches, a coach disciplines, a coach trains, and a coach corrects. We are living in a time where it is getting difficult for coaches to coach, right? Because they can't teach anymore. They can't discipline, they can't train, and they can't correct. And so our sports are going to really get crazy one of these years, okay? Because you have to have the coach. And this is what wisdom does as a moral coach for us, the idea of living life with skill. Having a moral coach to help us. And that's why relativism, which is the religion of today, where there's not absolute truth, why we go in chaos. Because there's not a coach anymore. It's just me, the way I feel about things. So in other words, to figure out what is true, this is what wisdom do. Helping us to figure out what is true, what is false, so that we can live that out, so that we can sort it out, because that's a lot of life. We aren't born with the knowledge, right? We have to learn it. And so when we are born, God gave us a brain and it's like a sponge. And so we're pulling things in. And so God gives his wisdom to help us to see so that we can sort things out in life so that we have skillful living. That's what the Proverbs are about. So verse 3 says, to receive instruction is wise behavior. This is skillful living. If we will take this wisdom and apply it to our lives, this is skillful living. This is what we will experience. And he says there is righteousness, there is justice, there is equity. Those three are very important. This is what nations are built on. Righteousness, justice, and equity. The word righteousness, it defines, now this is pretty deep, a righteous person. That was pretty deep, wasn't it? That sounds like Webster Dictionary. What is righteous? It is. Oh, never mind. But basically, it describes this. So a righteous person is basically one who will disadvantage themselves in order to advantage others. Okay? Jesus left heaven, came to this earth, died upon a cross. He disadvantaged himself to advantage others. That's the whole concept of God. That is wisdom. And so it's the idea. I may disadvantage myself to help the community. I may disadvantage myself that I work real hard to help my family. Or maybe a friend. Maybe a friend is sick, and so I work my job. I also help with their things. And that's what happens. And so when this happens, a community becomes better. Because I will disadvantage myself to help other people. Okay? And we see the opposite of that in the Old Testament is the time of the judges. There is chaos in Israel. Why? Because it tells you over and over again that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Chaos always happens. They became a weak nation and enemies would come in. Then they would repent, they would look to God, and the cycle would go over and over again, judge after judge. So wickedness, those that are wicked, when it talks about in Proverbs, are those that would be defined as those who disadvantage the community in order to advantage themselves. And whenever that happens, we see society, culture, and community starts to disintegrate. It just makes sense. If you have what I want and I go steal it from you, it's not going to help the community, is it? Okay? Everything starts falling apart. So skillful living takes place with righteousness. But also, as he says, justice. Justice basically means you give someone their due. It might be reward, it might be punishment. And you do that with not a respect to race, economic background, gender, anything like that. That's why simple justice is an eye for an eye. That is true justice. Okay, there's no regard to anything other than this is what happened, this is justice. I'm not saying it's the best justice, but it is simple justice. And so it is giving reward, it's giving punishment. And this is a part of what justice. There has to be justice for wisdom to take place for skillful living. And the third one is equity. And this word basically means to what is true, to what is level. So if you're doing something for me, it would be more like putting a picture on the wall. You make sure it's level. You have the level on it. You put the bubble in the middle. It's on the level. It's going to work. And so this is the idea here. There has to be fairness. Okay? There has to be fairness, that we treat people fair in anything, within our family, people we work with or maybe work for us, our neighbors, our family, everyone, that there has to be fairness for there to be skillful living. For wisdom to take place, there has to be righteousness, there has to be justice, there has to be equity, because these define skillful living. And when these behaviors are followed, life is better. Community is stronger. Culture is better. Society is. And wisdom celebrates functional and not the dysfunctional. Okay? And so we see that because these are functional. These are things that can be seen and lived out. Verse 4. We're not going to hit all the verses, okay? Just almost, no. To give prudence or sense to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. Because remember, knowledge is what is lived out, not just what's in the head here. So it is sorting out what is true, what is right. And he says here, to the youth, knowledge and discretion. Now, this is pretty good for most of us here. Youth isn't talking about middle schoolers or high schoolers, not in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it's talking about a lot of us, because there's the stages of manhood that you come to the final stage of becoming a man when you're 40, okay? So we see this takes in a big group. So it's not just talking about high schoolers, okay? Sean's back there. I'm finally a man, okay? That it's that whole aspect for us, that youth, we are in this youth process for a long, long time. See, the Greek culture is you get certain things in your head, then you go to the next stage. Now theirs is you learn, you carry it out, you experience it. And that's why then you can be on their court system, different things like that. Not until this experience can be seen within someone's life before you put them there. Verses 5 and 6. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. So it is saying to live skillfully, to be counted among the wise, you have to be teachable. If you're not teachable, you will never have the experience that this is being lived out within your life. So you have to be willing to listen and learn. Okay? Verse 7. Verse 7 is the anchor to all the Proverbs. Okay? This is the big idea, the thesis, whatever you have been taught to call it, the foundation. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So this is the thesis to what this whole book is about. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Fear, as most of us know, means respect. There's awe. There's the awe of God. And because the idea that we have that awe of God within our lives, we know God knows. God is the teacher. God knows the truth. He is the definer of right and wrong. God knows more than I do. So therefore I listen to him, I learn from him, and I submit to him. And that's what it means in the Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning. And it says beginning. This isn't chronology like there's 1, 2, 3. Okay, I start here, now I'll go to the second. It means foundation. So it's not so much running this way, it's just like you're building a house. The foundation is always the foundation. So as you build up, the foundation is what supports everything. Just like Jesus as he ends the Sermon on the Mount. A wise man and the foolish man, how they build their house, is what is being talked about here as well. So wisdom is how we build our lives, or it's going to be where it doesn't withstand the things that come along in life. So the fool is also defined, but he goes on later and defines the fool more. Basically, the fool is one that will not be taught. They will not listen. We would call them the know-it-all, okay? And that is one aspect that's used here within the Proverbs, the know-it-all. Someone who just doesn't need to learn. I don't need to be instructed. I don't need to listen. I know it all. The know-it-all despises wisdom and instruction. They don't need wisdom. They don't desire the skills because they believe they have it all there. But remember what wisdom is? It is skillful living. It can be seen. The know-it-all is quite obvious they don't know because it's not being lived out. Everybody can see it. You can say you understand, but it's not lived out, so there's not wisdom. And so because God knows it all, I become a learner because I don't know. And I need to learn from God. And so this is what it is saying here, helping us to see the value of wisdom, how important that is. Then when we come to verse 8, we have several verses that are describing how our life, the overflow of our life comes out of our choices. If we seek wisdom or if we don't, there's going to be consequences within our lives. And so some of that is being shown there. And then we're going to pick up again at verse 17. It comes to this question, how foolish are the foolish? Okay? How foolish are the foolish? And he tells us in verse 17, even birds get it, okay? He says, indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net inside of the bird. Okay, so if you're trying to catch a bird, don't let them see you put the trap out here. Okay, as I knew when I was a kid, when we would throw slop over the fence, when we would sneak around when there's snow on the ground, the starlings would come in. You better hide around the corner of the shop or something, because if they see you, they're going to fly off. If not, one shotgun blast could take a bunch of them, okay? They're smart enough to know if they see you setting a trap, this isn't the place to be. And we know that. How many different types of ways I've heard how to try to keep coons out of your corn. They may work for a week, right? That's kind of the way it works, okay? Because they learn, they see, they understand. And so birds get it. But it says in verse 18, but they, the foolish, lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. See, a bird sees a trap, and I'm going to stay away from it. But the foolish, they set the trap for themselves. They ambush their own lives. Set the trap. As we see, life is complex enough without us setting traps for ourselves. And so that's wisdom. Learn it, live it, then you don't set the trap. I have a heart for young people that are trying to figure out what is right and wrong, how to live skillfully. It's complex. It's confusing because there's so many voices. So many voices. And when we celebrate dysfunctional, those we celebrate have a pretty big voice. See, there was a time, and I believe that I grew up in that time, that most of the adults in our society were on the same page. There was a general sense of morality, and those that weren't, you just knew you kind of stayed away from them in society, okay? There was a general sense of right and wrong. And you got it from your parents, you got it from the schools, you got it from businesses, you got it from the government. It was just kind of that way. For the most part, everybody's on the same page. That's why my parents, as many of your all parents would say, if you got a whipping at school, you're going to get a whipping at home, because we were on the same page. We were all helping that skillful living to take place. Those days are gone. Oh, I see there's people in every aspect of society that help, but not everything coming together to help those outcomes. And so with competing voices, it's difficult. When you do not have the experience of life, when you're young, to see all these different things, it's hard. But one of the big things to remember, don't ambush yourself. As I've told a lot of kids, some of the kids that are here, you know, as you get to that point in your life, you're growing, you're looking to the next stage, just don't do something stupid, okay? Don't do something stupid. Don't ambush yourself. Verses 20 and 22. That was probably enough preaching on that. Wisdom shouts in the street, so lifts her voice in the square. And the head of the noisy street she cries out, and the entrance of the gates in the city she utters her sayings. How long? Now here's 3 different words for the foolish. O naive ones. Okay, how long, O naive ones? Will you have love being simple-minded? That's the second one. And scoffers, the third. Delight in themselves in scoffing and foolish knowledge. So it says wisdom is like a street preacher going out and proclaiming every place, in the marketplace, in the education systems, in the families, every place that there is wisdom. So live this out, because if you don't, there's consequences for it. And so as he says, there's different types of fools. The naive they just love being simple-minded. They're gullible. They don't think about much, and they believe just about anything to be true. And so they're easily swayed. The second category is scoffers, and these are the ones that they are driven by bitterness and anger. They scoff, they fight against the things of God, and they don't care about facts, they don't care about truth, they don't care about community or culture, and a lot of times not even their own friends because it's about themselves, okay? And so when they speak with a fire, you might say, coming out of their mouths. They destroy. That's the scoffers. And so there's anger, there's bitterness that is there. And the third category of fool is the know-it-all that we talked about just a little bit earlier. And they will say, you don't need to tell me. I don't want you to criticize me. I don't want you to judge me. I don't want you to correct me. Why? Because I know it all. And that's what the fool says. And so the term is defined correctly. Within this. But see, remember, knowledge comes by you living it out. You experience it. And so someone can't say, I know it all, when you can't see any traces of wisdom taking place in their life. They do not know it, because when you know it, you live it, is what it said. So this is experience. It is reality. Verse 23 says, wisdom cries out that it's not too late to be skillful, okay? It's not too late. It says, turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. So we can be foolish. We can do a lot of destructive things. But remember, wisdom is saying, I'm still here, okay? Please listen and to respond. And as God says, I'll pour my spirit out on you. Redemption is always available. In God's grace and mercy, he has made wisdom available. How cool that is. That God has given us a treasure chest full of how to live skillfully on this earth. That's why all scripture is inspired by God and is profitable. And we need to listen to him before it's too late. Because there's consequences if we don't. And that's verses 24 through 32. Consequences if we stay in foolishness. And it says, wisdom laughs at us. It doesn't say God laughs at us. It says wisdom does. Because wisdom tells you time and time again, this is what needs to happen. And so when you don't, wherever there is wisdom, it's just, you knew the outcome. You knew the way it was going to be because wisdom says this will be the consequences. Because it's always the consequence. And so the fool doesn't listen. The fool sets a trap, steps in their own trap. They ambush their own life, and wisdom mocks them. Because wisdom is saying, you don't know everything, or you could not live this way. Foolishness. Wisdom says foolishness is so ridiculous. That's what he's saying here. Verse 29, because they hated knowledge and did not choose to fear the Lord. And as we come to these two verses, 29 and 32, I believe that's the society we live in. We're becoming a society that hates knowledge because we have not chosen to be in awe of God. And I think it's quite obvious. Because we hear it all the time. We don't need the voice of God. We are a know-it-all society. We want God out of our schools, out of universities, out of government, out of neighborhood, out of any social discussion. And I believe for most of us as Christians, we don't want the government to set up a religion. We don't want that. We don't want them to create a theocracy. But it'd be nice if God's voice could just be listened to. And in every discussion that God's word could be brought into it. But it's been taught to us for a long time, no, all these things are neutral. When it comes to skillful living, there's not a neutral. Either you're wise or you're foolish. There's no in between. Okay? That's just the way it is. So we've tried to make our schools neutral, our universities, our marketplace, our social discussion. But neutrality is a myth. Because you can't make right decisions without wisdom. Right? There is no way possible without wisdom you can make right choices. So when you eliminate God's voice, what's left? I become my God. And so we get the religion of secularism or relativism, that we just kind of start all doing what is right within our own eyes. It creates chaos. Seems to be a little bit of that in our society, right? Because there's not wisdom. There's power. There's a lot of things being sought, but not wisdom. Verse 33 says there's a better way. But he who listens to me shall live securely and will be at ease from the dread of evil. See, God has set up laws that govern. We see natural laws within the universe, even though they're all natural laws when you come down to it. But there's natural laws we see, like gravity. That's a law that God has set up. We need to breathe what? Oxygen. That's a law that God has set up. We need food. We need to have water. We need to have rest. These are all natural laws. So if you're a relativist, which means there is no absolute truth, hold your breath. You will find out pretty quick there is natural law. We have to breathe or jump off of a building. Okay? It doesn't matter how much you believe that you won't fall, you will fall, because there's natural law. That's wisdom. We see that. God has set these things up. But just as true as these types of natural law, God has set up moral law, social laws, and spiritual laws. They're just as true. They're just as binding. And when you choose to ignore them, just like if you choose to defy gravity, there's consequences. The same way, if you choose to defy moral law, social law, or spiritual law, you can try to ignore it, but they are still true. There will still be consequences. So guess what? True truth always wins. Okay? That's just the way it works. We can say we don't believe in God. We can say it's all about us. We can say that we just got here by random chance. You can see through history the law of God. That's part of wisdom. We can see it. We can see it works. We can see the consequence when you follow, the consequence when you don't. True truth always wins. No matter what you believe. Our belief does not make something a fact. God's wisdom is the fact. So as our worship team comes up, just a little more thought here. I'll say a phrase that I hate people to say. At the end of the day, I hate that phrase, but I'll say it. At the end of the day, every one of us makes choices to whether or not we think God knows. Do we believe God knows or not? And God has opened up a treasure chest to help us as individuals, as cultures, as society, how to live skillfully. The Proverbs is one of those places to look. You can choose to believe, or you can choose to be a fool. That's really what it comes down to. Either you choose to be wise or you choose to be a fool. There's nothing in between. So listen, you can't beat the system. God has created the system, and you can't beat it. But even though we may have been foolish, we see there's redemption, right? That God will pour his Spirit out, and we can have a second chance to be redeemed, even though we have sinned, because of Jesus Christ, and step in the way of wisdom, in the way of skillful living again. And so really it's our choice. What will we do? So listen to the right voice. Let's stand together as we sing.